Well, no House of Commons sittings this week and none next week. These are the kind of quiet weeks you want if you're hoping for a hot story to die. But it's not been an F-35 free week for the government or for Peter MacKay. Chantal is off this week, but no break for Andrew and Bruce. They're both here. Help me with where this story is right now, because at times you think if the government wanted this to turn into a story about accounting and budgets and reviews, then they got their wish.
They've certainly been trying to do that. I think what's happened in the past week is that any doubt that might have persisted in the past about whether or not the government knowingly deceived the public on the cost of these jets has been dispelled. They did. What originally was a story after the Auditor-General's report about a massive breakdown in departmental procedures where this thing sailed through without any of the proper scrutiny, I think has become much more focused on the specific aspect of deliberately false cost estimates that were put out there. False relative to their own internal numbers. And the attempt to try to turn this into a dispute about accounting, there is no dispute. The policy of the Auditor-General is the policy of the Department of Defense. They are at one. The only difference is between the public numbers that were presented and the private numbers, the two sets of books the government was keeping.
All right, I get all that, but I'm wondering whether it travels.
I guess I don't think it does travel as much as Andrew and others who share that point of view would hope, perhaps. I do think that the government has been trying to fog the lens here in the same way that they did on robocalls. They tried to make the robocalls issue be an issue about whether robots were used to make telephone calls rather than somebody was trying to mislead voters into not voting or suppress the vote. And in the same sense, I think they're trying to make this a dry accounting issue, an issue of, well, we counted these numbers and not that. Maybe it was a screw-up, but it wasn't a lie. Maybe robocalls was a screw-up, but it wasn't unethical. So that's the pattern that the government's following. As to whether it's getting anywhere, I guess I do feel that there's quite a bit of outrage about what's gone on. But the outrage is, yet again, contained to that roughly 30% of the population who pay attention to politics and to a lot of the people who are in the news media and the opposition benches. This matters a lot and should matter more to more Canadians. I'm not sure it's there yet.
Let me show you something that happened this week in terms of one of the principals of the story. Peter MacKay had a news conference. He had, you know, a fair number of things to try and say in the defense of himself and I guess his department and the issue in broad terms. Here's one part, though, that he said that caused some controversy. Watch this.
He's put out his numbers and National Defence's numbers, including the Parliamentary Budget Officer's report, and the contingency, operating costs, and National Defence personnel, which I've just referred to in a previous answer, are not included in the Parliamentary Budget Officer's accounting.
Well, actually, that turned out not to be the case. They were in his, but they weren't in the Defence Department or the Minister's Department's own document. Now, this is where we get into the numbers and who can follow this whole story. But nevertheless, that was what was said. The opposition called a news conference the next day, and the normally mild-mannered astronaut, scientist, iconic Canadian figure, Marc Garneau, had this to say about Peter MacKay. Watch this.
Is he trying to pull a quick one on us again, hoping that that the general public is not going to see this? Or is he not too bright?
All right, you don't hear that kind of stuff very often. Is that over the top?
It's a mistake. Look, he goofed up, certainly on that particular occasion, Peter MacKay did. Couldn't tell the difference between his own department's numbers and the Parliamentary Budget Office's numbers. Anybody can make a mistake. The issue here isn't Peter MacKay goofing up on the day, it's this deliberate campaign of deception about what their own internal numbers were saying. The only conflict here is between their public numbers and their private numbers, not between them and the Auditor-General or the PBO. To turn it into a thing about how dumb is Peter MacKay, it's not good form to begin with. Let the public decide for themselves if they think he's not the sharpest knife in the drawer. It's not for his political opponents, in my opinion, to go there.
Okay, this has been going on for 2 weeks. Peter MacKay still has the job in spite of a number of different calls for him to resign. Does that surprise you that he's still in the job, given the nature of the story?
Well, it does and it doesn't. I guess I think that the government's calculus as to what else they need to do to put this issue away once and for all, or at least for an extended period of time, is that they look at the amount of outrage that there is out there, and then they kind of wonder whether there's anybody else that people might vote for. And they look at those two things together and decide, okay, there's too much outrage and there is an alternative, maybe we need to do something differently. Perhaps with the number of polls coming out in the last little while that have the NDP tied with the Conservatives, this will make the government feel a little bit more more inclined to do something more rather than do nothing more, which I think would have been their habit in the past. But the last point I would say is that this is just another example of really stumble-prone communications by this government over the last several months. You could sort of look at their budget and say, well, that thing sort of worked, but it worked in spite of itself. And everything else that they've been doing in terms of communications management has been really quite weak in the recent months.
Well, Andrew, you've gone a lot further than calling it a communications issue on some of this stuff in terms of the big picture of the story. Here's the end of your latest column, which is pretty hard-hitting. This issue, the whole story here, is about whether we live in a functioning parliamentary democracy or want to. Now, is that going over the top?
I don't think so. I mean, this is the convergence points, this particular issue, of a whole lot of pretty troubling trends in the way in which we're governed, not just under this government, but under previous governments. The decline of ministerial responsibility, the decline of Parliament's ability to hold governments to account, the decline of truth-telling in politics. You put it all together, and what do we have here? We have a major requisition of tens of billions of dollars of public funds being spent not only without proper scrutiny and proper oversight, but without the informed consent of either Parliament, from whom these numbers were kept, or the public, who were lied to through the last election. I don't know how much more serious that gets.
Well, I agree that it's an important issue. I guess I look at it in two ways, though. I do think that it's important for journalists and the opposition parties to hold the government to account for these things and to do what they have been doing, which is really try to raise the volume, prolong the discussion of these issues, despite the fact that we're all so easily distracted by so many things in our lives and the various media that come at us now. But I also look at voters and say, why aren't voters protecting this democracy more? If these issues matter as much as Andrew suggests, and others obviously make the case as well, then what about that other 65% of voters who aren't paying much attention, who routinely one issue after the other say, oh, you know what, a pox on all their houses? That frankly doesn't help solve the problem. It helps perpetuate it and maybe make it worse.
And, you know, how do you respond to that? Because it's true. I mean, there's been a whole run of these. You know, we just mentioned robocalls and F-35, and it doesn't seem to engage.
Well, whether it doesn't engage or whether people fit it into some larger picture of who they want to govern them. And that's their privilege as voters. I mean, people used to rail against Bill Clinton for the lies that he told, and somebody once put the formulation, the issue isn't whether he's a liar, it's whether he's too much of a liar. And people made the judgment in their wisdom that he wasn't too much of a liar, at least until the very end. So the public in their wisdom can make these decisions, but they should at least get all the information. And yes, they should pay attention. I think we suffer from defects in our institutional mechanisms. Parliament is far too weak compared to the government of the day, and our MPs on all parties have been far too willing to play fast and loose with the truth, which hurts all of their credibility. But we as the voting public have an obligation, if we want to have a democracy, to pay attention.
All right.